Tosus here, Dibra Masel Katan, on Daf Samachet Samid Beis, points out that everybody agrees, according to all shitos in the Gemara in Gittin, that a katan is zocha li atzmo da'oraisa. And Tosus says, how could this be? The Mishnah says in Gittin that a katan who picks up an aveda, we have to substantiate his kinyan based on the principle of darkei shalom, which means it's only d'Rabbanan. So how can we say that a katan is zocha li atzmo d'oraisa? And that's according to everyone, whether it's Rav Asi or Rav Chizda in the name of Shmuel. The machlokus between them is only about zochel acherim, which we'll get to in just a minute. So in order to justify the concept of katan zochel li atzmo as a kinyan d'oraisa, Tosus says because of das acheres makna. In the case of hefker, there's no das acheres makna, and therefore that kinyan is only d'Rabbanan, and the Gemara establishes in Masechet Gittin that that's mishum darkei shalom as a rabbinic institution. So katan zochel li atzmo d'oraisa means das acheres makna. Let's say I am a gadol, I give a katan a gift, or I sell him an object. So that's the das makna, and he's kohen d'oraisa. Tosus has a very complicated proof, which, if you remember a few days ago, we got stuck on. I still haven't solved that problem yet. That the proof is that he could be podeh maser sheni, even though he's a katan, on behalf of the gadol. And that has to be a kinyan d'oraisa. But again, the fact that he could be zochel acherim, that we're not ready for that. We'll need another few minutes for that. That's only the shita Rav Asi. But what seems to be unilaterally accepted is that he could be zochel li atzmo. Even Rav Chizda, in the name of Shmuel, agrees to Rav Asi that he could be zochel li atzmo. And Tosus introduces the concept of das acheres makna. We had a long discussion about the original source for this halacha of das acheres makna in the Gemara of Rav Papa in Bava Metzia Daf Yud Aleph Amid Beis, and there Rav Papa uses das acheres makna to establish that a chotzer could be kohen through das acheres makna on behalf of the Baal HaChotzer, even if eino omed b'tzad sadei, even though the chotzer is eino mishtameres. So that's the power of das acheres makna. And Tosus makes a jump from that halacha in chotzer to the halacha being zocha of a katan being zocha through das acheres makna. Okay, then. I'm just going to move the computer into the other room for a second, if you could bear with me. Okay, then, so we're getting reorganized here. I'll just close the door. Okay, and we should be pretty much good to go. Okay. Okay. Now we want to discuss the unique shita of Asi in the Gemara in Gittin, who maintains that not only is a Katan Zocha liatzmo, but he Zocha even lacherim. And that's the Shita of Rav Asi in the Gemara in Gittin on Daf Samach Daled Amud Beis. So what's the exact scenario? We have Ruvain, the Makne, and we have Shimon the Kone. And Ruvain gives the object to a Katan, and the Katan is Zocha on behalf of Shimon. By the way, Ruvain, I'm not sure if I have your email address. Just if you can make sure that I get that, because you asked me to send you a paper. Okay, next. So we have the following problem. How does Das Acheres Makne help for the Katan, to allow the Katan to be Zocha Lacherim? We're talking about Shlichus. And the Katan is going to make a Zechia, a Kinyan, on behalf of a Gadol, on behalf of Shimon, we called it. The Katan is not included on the Shlichus. Unless Tosfos means to say that Das Acheres Makne is going to supply the Das on behalf of Shimon. So Ruvain's Das will substitute for Shimon's Das. So we have a Das Makne, we don't need a Das Kone. And the Katan in the middle is doing the Maisa Kinyan. And we're going to have to say that, although Zechia Mitam Shlichus, I only need the Zechia Mitam Shlichus to set up a Das, but the Katan is not excluded from Shlichus as far as the Maisa Kinyan is concerned. But that's very difficult. I mean, Tosfos doesn't make any chilukim. He doesn't say that, Zechias Mitam Shlichus only for the Das, but not for the Maisa Kinyan. So it would seem that even as far as the Maisa Kinyan is concerned, that even though there's Das Acheres Makne, the Katan should not be able to operate as a Zocha on behalf of the Makabel, or call him Shimon, because a Katan is not a Bar Shlichus. So the Maisa of a Katan in Zechia as a shliach of the recipient is meaningless. So again, just to summarize, according to Rabbi Asi, who holds Das Acheres Makne operates even to be Zocha, for the Katan to be Zocha Lacherim, how does the Katan achieve that? Through Das Acheres Makne, if the Katan is excluded from Shlichus and Zchias Mitam Shlichus. So at this point, we introduce Reb Chaim. And this is the Reb Chaim in Hilchas Yibum. We've quoted this Reb Chaim in the past. And Reb Chaim has a Gemara in Ksubis on Daf Ayin Daled with the Tosfos there. And Reb Chaim gives us a very deep and fundamental understanding of that Sugya. The Gemara in Ksubis Daf Ayin Daled establishes that kol sheyeshno b'shlichus yeshno b'tanai, kol she'ena b'shlichus ena b'tanai. Only someone who has the power to appoint a shliach can make a tanai. And Tosfos there asks the obvious question: what's the connection between shlichus and tanai? Why are they interdependent? If there is shlichus, there's a possibility of a tanai. If there's no shlichus, there's no possibility of tanai. So Tosfos answers the following. It's just a very short line in Tosfos. He says, Hainu taima, hoil v'maisa kol kach biyado, sheyochel l'kaimo yidei shliach, svarahu sheyeh kmochen biyado l'shvuye beitna. So the key word in this Tosfos is biyado. And Tosfos says that we have an interdependence between Tanai that's dependent upon Shliach through this concept or vis-a-vis this concept of biyado. Tosfos says, you want to make a Tanai, it's got to be biyado. You want to appoint a Shliach, it's got to be biyado. And now we have the litmus test. Wherever Shlichus operates, it means it's biyado. And if it's biyado, then you can make a Tanai. If Shlichus doesn't operate, you cannot make a Shliach, then it's not biyado, and therefore you cannot make a Tanai. So Reb Chaim jumps in here to interpret this Tosfos. And he introduces two new concepts and distinctions in defining this Tosfos. One concept he calls bailus, and the other concept he calls das. In order to create a shliach, you have to be the bailim. What does that mean? Says Reb Chaim, bailus in this context manifests itself in the ability to create a chalos. You will create the chalos. Let's take a classic case of kiddushin. You're the bailim to create the chalos kiddushin. Gerushin. You're the bailim to create the chalos gerushin. Says Reb Chaim, if you're the bailim to create the chalos, then there are two nafkaminas. Number one, you're the bailim to create a shliach. You can now send a shliach. The fact that you can appoint a shliach is an expression of your bailus. You're creating the chalos, and you can appoint a shliach to create the chalos on your behalf. Number two, you need das. Of course, that's going to come to exclude a katan, or for that matter, a cherish and a shota. There are lav b'nei das. Then Reb Chaim says that within the world of halacha, there's something that an action creates a chalos, but without das, without bailus. You're not a bailim to create the chalos. The Torah creates the chalos. The Torah only asks you to do the maisa, and then the Torah takes over and generates the chalos. In such a case, all you need is kavana, and you don't need das. What's the difference between das and kavana? Das means you are creating a chalos. Das means that everything is, as Tosfos calls it, biyado. You will create the chalos. So you will destroy a chalos that existed before and create a new chalos to substitute. For that, you need das. So bailus expresses itself in das. A katan cannot create a chalos because he's a labar das. But what can a katan achieve? Havana. He can set up a maisa, and now the Torah takes over and creates the chalos. Or you could formulate it slightly different. The chalos is me'elav. It's automatic. In any case where a katan and his action is validated, and the Torah creates the chalos, the katan cannot appoint a shliach. Why? Because he's not the bailim and he doesn't have das. He has kavanah to create a maisa, but he doesn't have das to create the chalos. And he doesn't require das to create the chalos. For example, chalitza says Reb Chaim, is fundamentally different than Gittin and Kiddushin. In Chalitza, the Gemara wants to know if a Cheresh, who's a La Bardas, does Chalitza, where this Chalitza is acceptable. And the Gemara answers, well, the problem with the Cheresh is that he's not a Bar Kriya. The Torah in the Parsha of Chalitza requires Kriya to read the Parsha, and he's not capable of reading the Parsha insofar as he's mute. And if the Gavra is a La Bar Kriya, then he cannot achieve a Chalitza. So Reb Chaim asks, why did the Gemara have to come up with this new, sophisticated, complicated halacha, somersaults in the air, that he's a La Bar Kriya? Just tell me he's a La Bar Das. The answer is because Chalitza doesn't require Das. Who's the Bailim over the Chalos Heter Hayavam Ashuk? It's the Torah itself. It's a Chalos that's Chal Mi'elov. It's not that you create that Heter. You just do the Maisa. And if the Cheresh was capable of doing the Maisa, he would have Kavana. If the Katan, for example, was more mature and he reaches a level of understanding where he can have Kavana to do the Maisa, then the Torah will take over the Chalos. Reb Chaim adds another element to this whole distinction between Das and Kavana, and that's called Eidus L'Kiyum Adover. Reb Chaim insists that whenever you need Das, you need Eidus L'Kiyum Adover. For example, in Gittin and Kiddushin. But in a case where all you need is a Maisa and Kavana for that Maisa, you don't need Eidus L'Kiyum Adover, you only need Eidus L'Bir Adover. Now, Reb Chaim, to prove that Chalitza doesn't require Das, in addition to the proof that we mentioned earlier about the fact that a Cheresh is only excluded because he's a La Bar Kriya, Reb Chaim quotes a Gemara in Yevamis on Daf Kuf Vav Hamid Aleph, and the Gemara there says that Chalitza Mutes, Miloshen Tos, Kshera. Now, whenever you require Das, Reb Chaim points out, Tos undermines Das. So why is Chalitza Mutes Kshera when the Das is a mistaken Das? There was a Tos in the Ikar Das, in his Ratzon, in his decision. But the answer is, all we need is Kavanah Tzamaisa, we don't need Das in Chalitza. And as we said before, Chalitza would not require Eidus L'Kiyum Adover, but it would suffice to have Eidus L'Bir Adover. So now let's get back to Tosfos about Zchiyah Mitam Shlichus with the arsenal in a back pocket of Reb Chaim. Zchiyah Mitam Shlichus makes sense when there's a requirement of Das. Why? Because as Reb Chaim says, your ability to appoint a shliach is based on the fact that you have das to create the chalos. And within the purview of your das to create the chalos, you can appoint a shliach. So it's very possible to be zocher on behalf of someone else, mitam zocher liyodam shlo b'fanav, and implement a kinyan on his behalf, because shlichus, zechir mitam shlichus, he's the das koneh. He can appoint a shliach because he's got das. He's the bailim over the chalos. We can't force him against his will to acquire ownership on an object. We need his agreement and his das. And as we said before, he can appoint a shliach. He can also make it tonight. So Zchiyah Mitam Shlichus works whenever you need Das. And as Reb Chaim says, the requirement of Das is a reflection of the fact that you're the Bailim over the Chalos. Hence, you can make a Shliach, and now Zchiyah could be Mitam Shlichus. But what happens in a case of Zchiyah without Das? What does that mean? That's called Das Acheres Makna. Das Acheres Makna means that if I'm selling you something or giving you something as a gift, if it's a zchus for you and it's a benefit for you, I can achieve that without your das. You don't need das kona, because it's das acheres makna. So now, if you're not receiving this gift through das, then you don't have bailus. How could schiyah be mitam shlichus? You can't create a shliach. So the person who's zoch on your behalf could not possibly be your shliach, because you don't have the power to create a shliach, because the chalos is not dependent and generated by your das. And if there's no das, then there's no shlichus, as we saw in Reb Chaim. And that means, Rabbosai, that there's going to be a new din of zechiyah that works independent of shlichus. Why? Because there's a zechiyah of das acheres makna, in which case you don't need the das hazocha. If you don't need the das hazocha, the one who's acquiring ownership here, then he can't make a shliach. In which case, by definition, it cannot be zechiyah mitam shlichus. If zechiyah was operating within shlichus, you've got a major problem here, because the das kona is not required here at all. All you need is das acheres makna. So we don't need das bailim to clinch this kinyan. Then zechiyah can't be working with the din of shlichus, because shlichus only operates when there's das bailim. Here there's no din of das bailim. It must mean that in this case of das acheres makna, zechiyah is a new din, a new category with its own life, its own personality, its own mechanics, and it's not based on shlichus. So therefore, if Reuven wants to give a gift to Shimon, and he wants to avail himself of the services of a Katan, and he gives the object over to the Katan, and the Katan is now zocha on behalf of Shimon the Gadol, we now have das acheres makna, in which case we don't need Shimon's das kona on the receiving end, in which case Shimon cannot create a shliach, in which case zechiyah cannot be mitam shlichus. And if zechiyah is not mitam shlichus, we have a brand new halach of zechiyah. So even though the katan is a la bar shlichus, but he's included in the parsha of zechiyah, insofar as zechiyah is not operating within shlichus. So again, even though Tosfos points out that zechiyah is mitam shlichus, he was not including in that principle the case of das acheres makna. Das acheres makna is zechiyah shalom mitam shlichus, and it has to be so according to Reb Chaim, because das acheres makna means we don't need the das kona, and if we have waived the requirement of das kona, then the kona could not possibly make a shliach, and the zechiyah that's operating here could not be based on shlichus. And al karchach, we have no choice but to assume and establish that zechiyah is a separate category unto itself. And now the katan could be zochel acherim, and he's not operating as a shliach. Okay. Now we move on to another issue. I'm not going to talk about Pidyon Maser Sheni, even though that's really what we're up to, because I still haven't solved that problem. But I would like to discuss with you another part of Tosfos. And this we began the other day. So if you're looking at the middle size lines of Tosfos, 2 lines before they end, V'im Tomar. So just indicate to me if you have the place. Yeah, you're on board. V'im Tomar. Heich yischayev Adam Asham al Gzela. Okay, so let's go through this again. It always bears repetition. And we're talking about a parsha in Bamidbar Perek Hey, in which Ruvain accuses Shimon of being a gazlan. So Ruvain sues Shimon in a court of law, claiming that Shimon stole his property. Shimon takes a shvua based on the taina of Ruvain to be machish Ruvain and claim innocence. He's not guilty of theft. Took a shvua. Then Shimon admits and confesses his crime. I stole and I perjured myself with that shvua. It's a false shvua. So the Torah says the following. If all things are equal, and the tovea, the nigzal, is alive and well, the gazlan has to pay keren v'chomesh, and he has to bring a korban hasham because of his false shvua. However, the Torah stipulates that if the gazlan, the tovea, we call the Ruvain, dies, then it works like this. The gazlan, now having confessed his crime, would have to pay the keren v'chomesh to the yarshim, to the heirs of Ruvain, of the nigzal. If Ruvain has no heirs, then the gazlan pays that money to the Kohen. So the Gemara here in Masechet Sanhedrin wonders, what do you mean there are no heirs? The pasuk says, "In ein la ish goel." Goel means an heir, a yorish. Is there someone in the Jewish community that doesn't have a yorish? Everyone has a yorish. What does it mean in ein la ish goel? So the Gemara answers that we're talking about a ger. Now, if a ger gets married to a Jewish girl and has a child, he has yarshim. But let's say the ger died tragically before he had children. I think we knew such a ger. I'm trying to remember his name. I think his name was Carmel. In any event, so this ger who dies without leaving children has no yarshim. Why? Because gersh and his guy katan shenolad dam, so he's not related halachically to his biological relatives. Now, if you turn for a moment to Daf Samach Tesam and Aleph, the Gemara says, "V'yomar achmonim ein la ish goel." But aval katan, you want to know whether this ger has children or not? Check it out. But if this ger is a katan and he's not ish, so the pasuk is excluding a katan. You don't even have to check him out. A katan cannot bear children, cannot father a child. So what this means, Rabbosai, is that the entire parsha of Keren v'chomesh, in the case of the gazlan who took the shvua and then confessed his crime, applies even to a katan, even if the nigzal is a katan. Again, if he's a ger, then the Torah is saying the money is going to be paid to the kohen, because a ger katan doesn't have any yarshim. But if he wasn't the ger and he was a katan, then the monies have to be paid to the katan. And even in the case of a ger, the monies have to be paid to the Kohen if the Ger Katan dies. But you see that the Ger Katan, or for that matter, any Katan, is Mechayev Keren V'chomesh. In fact, he's even Mechayev the Shvuah. Therefore, when the Gazlan who is accused takes his Shvuah, he has to do so because of the lawsuit against him that's being instituted or generated by the Katan in this case, and he has to take a Shvuah. If he admits later on that he took the Shvuah falsely, he's got to pay Keren V'chomesh. Now, if the Katan dies, then we have to see if there are any Yarshim, if he's a Ger as well. Prektosis. V'im tomer hechis chayev adam ashav al gzela. How can the parsha of Keren V'chomesh and Asham be applicable to someone who stole from a Katan? Ha'ein nishboi al tainas cherish shotav v'Katan k'dashinan be'agozel kama u'beperek shvuas adayonim ki yitein ish v'ein nesinas Katan klum. Are you able to quickly do me a favor and open up Bava Kama Kuvav Hamid Beis? Ein nishba and al tainas cheresh shot v'katan. So if a taina of a katan could not possibly generate a shvuah, how could the parsha of Asham apply to a shvuah? In the case of a katan, the katan is in the exile, so his taina is a tainus katan, and a tainus katan is not able to generate a chiyuv shvuah. So how could the parsha of shvuah sheker with its Keren V'chomesh and Asham apply to the case where the Nigzal, the Tovea, is a Katan, if Ein Nishban al Tainas Katan? I mean, Tosa is going to be so hard-pressed by this that in one of his answers, he's going to say, well, the Nigzal, the Gazlan, jumped ahead and took a Shvuah on his own initiative. That's called Kofetz V'Nishba.
Where's the Gemara in Bava Kama?
Kufavam and Beis.
Kufavam and Beis.
106b.
Yeah.
And see if you could find Ein Nishban al Tainas Cheresh Shotav V'Katan. You find such a thing? Ruvain, do you remember that we touched on this yesterday? But it's good to have a chazara.
No.
All right. I don't want to hold us up right now. So Tosa says, "V'yesh lomar tahani mili b'tainas kfira voda aval pied echad nishbayin inam b'kovtz v'nishba." Tosa says that if the katan who's accusing a gadol of being a gazlan, of stealing from him, has the evidence of one witness to support his claim, then we have a din doraisa that the echad is mechayev shvuah. And what Tosas is postulating is that forget about the taina of the katan, leave that on the back burners. the shvu has to be taken here on the part of the accused Gazlan by virtue of the Eid Echad. The Eid Echad is testifying that he stole. And he has to take a shvuah to be machish the Eid Echad. And that shvuah stands on its own, so to speak, meaning on the 2 feet. Well, every Eid Echad has 2 feet. On the 2 feet of the Eid Echad. So what generates the shvuah? Not the Katan, whose taina was put forward against this gadol, accusing him of gzela, but rather by the Eid Echad. I'm not 100% sure I understand why Tosfos mentions Dafka Eid Echad and not, let's say, Modu Mixas HaTaina, or even Shavuos HaShomrim for that matter. I suspect that in the case of Modu Mixas, there would be no Shavuot. And for that matter, even in the case of Shomer, there would be no Shvuah. Why? Because Ein Nishban al Tainis Katan. What generates the Chiv Shvuah in Modu Mixas is the Taina of the Katan. And Hu Adin Hu Atam in the case of Shomer. But in the case of Eid Echad, that's a whole different story. The Eid Echad himself could be Mechayev Shvuah. So Tosfos figured out a scenario in which the parsha of Asham would apply even if the Nigzal, the Tovea, was a Katan, and the Gazlan took a Shvuah, not because of the Tainis Katan, but because of the Eidus of Eid Echad. But in the case of Modu B'Mixas, it would be the Tainas HaKatan that would generate the Shvuah. Now, how do we know that there's a difference between Modu B'Mixas and Eid Echad? How do we know that in Modu B'Mixas, it's the Taina that generates the Shvuah, but in Eid Echad, it's not the Taina, but rather the Eid Echad? After all, the Eid Echad is supporting the Taina of the Toen, of the Tovea. And Modu B'Mixas is also support for the Taina of the Tovea. No. In the case of Eid Echad, it's not the Taina of the Tovea that generates the Shvuah, but rather the Eid Echad. In the case of Modu B'Mixas, it's the Taina. How do we know? How does Tosfos know? And the answer is a sugya in Shvuas Daf Lamed Ches Hamid Beis. And there the Gemara makes a fundamental distinction between the Taina that generates Modu B'Mixas and the Taina that's supported by an Eid Echad. The Gemara wants to know what is the minimum amount of mammon, of money, of value, to generate a Shvuah. And you and I would have said intuitively, it's got to be a Shavah Pruta, which is the share of Mammon and Kol HaTorah Kula. And the Gemara indeed establishes a difference here between Modu B'Mixas and Eid Echad. Eid Echad fits into that pattern that we thought was intuitive, that all you need is a taina of a Shavah Pruta. That's Mammon. And the Eid Echad is supporting that claim of a Pruta, and the Nitba has to take a Shvuah. Not so in the case of Modu B'Mixas. A Hodah and a Pruta would not generate a Shvuah Doraisa of Modu B'Mixas. What you need is a minimum taina of shtei kesef. So the taina was on shtei kesef, the hodah was on one of the two, and he was makrish and denied the other. So it's hodah b'miktsas and a kfira b'miktsas. And he takes a shvua of moda b'miktsas because the tviyah, the taina, was on shtei kesef. What's the difference here between moda b'miktsas and eid echad? Why is it that in eid echad a taina of a pruta is enough to generate a shvua dorais of eid echad, whereas in moda b'miktsas you need a taina of shtei kesef? And the answer is that there are certain standards and regulations with regard to a taina. Certain conditions have to be met with regard to a taina to recognize the validity of a taina to generate a shvua. When the taina itself generates the shvua, we need shtei kesef. In eid echad, it's a different halacha. Forget about the taina. The chiyuv shvua is to be machish the edus of the eid echad. The eid echad himself, independent of the taina, will generate the shvua. And what is the taina of the eid echad? A pruta. The eid echad is testifying that Shimon owes Ruvain mammon, and the shear of mammon and kol tarkula is a pruta. With regard to the shvua of moda b'miktsas, it's the taina of the toveh that generates the shvua. And now we have to set up a taina on the highest level of shtei kesef. But when it's the eid echad who's mechayev the shvua, then we don't care about the taina. As long as the mammon on the table that's under contention is worth a pruta, it's mammon and kol tarkula, take a shvua to be machish the eid echad. And then Afkamina now is going to be Katan. Einish Barnal Tainus Katan. But that's only when the shvu is generated by the taina of the Katan, like for example, Moda V'Ixas. But if the testimony of the Eid Echad supports the claim of the Katan, I don't need the taina to generate the shvu. As we saw before, even a Shava Prut is enough because it's the Eidus of the Eid Echad that generates the shvu. And if that be the case, we begin to understand Tosas's answer. Why is it that if the Eid Echad testifies on behalf of the Katan, we can apply the parsha of Keren v'chomesh v'yasham when a Gazlan under oath denies falsely the claim that he's a Gazlan? There's a Katan here. The Nigzal is a Katan. The Toveh is a Katan. Einish Bain al Tainus Katan. But the answer is that the Katan's taina, which is not really a taina legally, not recognized, but it's enough to bring in the edus of an Eid Echad, and the Nigzal now has to take the oath in order to be machish the Eid Echad. If now the Gazlan takes the oath, denying that he stole, and then he admits he confesses his crime, he will be chayav karban asham and dalet and keren v'chomesh, even though the taina is a tainus katan. Because even if we disqualify the tainus katan, what we end up with is Eid Echad, and the Eid Echad himself, independent of the taina, is machayev a shvu. And if that shvu is taken falsely, then the repercussions are going to be the parsha of Asham and Keren v'chomesh. Okay, Rabbos, I think this is where we'll stop for today. And if it's Shem, we'll try to wrap this up tomorrow. Okay, then? So thank you so much and have a great day. And Ruvain, if